So imagine this. You wake up one morning, you check your phone, and you find out that your entire public identity, your life's work, is being systematically confused with your ideological opposite.
That's a nightmare scenario.
It's a total nightmare, and that's exactly the bizarre, surreal situation that the author Naomi Klein found herself in.
Right, with Naomi Wolf.
Exactly. For years, Klein, the journalist we all know for her work on corporate globalization, on structural exploitation, she was constantly being mistaken for Naomi Wolf.
Who, it's worth remembering, was a major figure in third-wave feminism. But then during the pandemic, she just took a hard turn.
A very hard turn. She went deep into this digital underworld of conspiracy theories. She became one of the most visible faces of the anti-vaccine, anti-mask movement.
And she was framing it in these really extreme terms, right? Like genocidal plots for elite control.
Right, absolutely. And you've got these two women. They share a first name, a public profile, but their politics are just polar opposites.
Yeah.
And that confusion, that personal identity crisis for Klein, it becomes this perfect, chilling metaphor for our whole fractured reality.
It forced her to go down the rabbit hole herself.
It did, to understand not just her own situation, but the bigger picture. So today, that's what we're going to do. We're doing a deep dive using sources related to Klein's work, especially her book, Doppelganger.
And we're going to try and connect the dots between three huge, unsettling ideas.
Exactly. First, the structural exploitation that, completely hollowed out our trust in institutions. This is her famous concept. Disaster capitalism.
Then the result of that, the psychological and social fracture she calls the mirror world.
And finally, the new technological layer on top of all of it, this crisis of AI doppelgangers and deepfakes.
I think the mission here, and it's an ambitious one, is to go beyond just saying that's misinformation.
Yes. It's not about simple fact-checking. We need to get at the why. Why are people so willing to believe these things? And the answer, really, lies in those systemic failures that bred the distrust in the first place.
That's the only place to start. You can't understand the digital chaos without understanding the economic and political rot that came first. And that all begins with the idea Klein first started talking about back in the mid-2000s, disaster capitalism.
It's the source code for the breakdown of trust.
Okay, so let's define that. What, at its core, is disaster capitalism?
At its core, it's the deliberate exploitation of a huge collective crisis. Think of an economic collapse, a war, a natural disaster, or a pandemic.
And it's exploited for what purpose?
For private profit, and this is the key, for radical free market restructuring. It's not just about some shady contractor overcharging for supplies. It's about using the public's shock and disorientation as a window to push through an ideological agenda.
And the method for that is what she famously called the shock doctrine, right? That sounds clinical, almost brutal. It is brutal. And yes, it's very clinical. The shock doctrine is the mechanism. It's how powerful free market fundamentalists, often people from the Chicago School of Economics, leverage a massive crisis. They use that moment of shock to rapidly push through deeply unpopular neoliberal policies.
Policies they could never pass under normal democratic conditions.
Exactly. Because people are in a state of collective shock. They're focused on survival, on finding family, on just getting through the day. They're not, paying attention to policy debates. And that's the moment when you can privatize public assets and slash regulations without any real resistance.
Klein identifies a kind of package deal they push through, a holy trinity of policies. What's in that package?
So the holy trinity is their blueprint. It has three main parts. First, mass privatization of public goods, think schools, energy grids, healthcare.
Okay.
Second, sweeping deregulation. You strip away environmental protections, labor laws, anything that gets in the way of corporate profit. And third, deep, severe cuts to social spending. You get the public safety net.
So it's basically an organized raid on the public sphere.
That's a perfect way to put it. Disasters stop being collective tragedies that require solidarity and instead become exciting market opportunities. And the result, of course, is a massive upward redistribution of wealth and skyrocketing inequality.
And this isn't just a theory. She provides really devastating, concrete examples of how this plays out in the real world.
Oh, absolutely. The historical record it's pretty damning. You just have to look at Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans back in 2005.
Right. A huge natural disaster.
A catastrophe. It ravaged the city, displaced hundreds of thousands of people. But instead of a massive public reinvestment program, Klein documented how the disaster was immediately seized on as an opportunity to roll out pre-existing plans for privatization.
The schools,
Yeah.
specifically.
The schools, it's the most glaring example. Almost the entire public school system was wiped out and replaced with charter schools. It created this two-tier, deeply unequal education system. And that kind of radical transformation was only possible because the public infrastructure had literally been shocked out of existence.
And you see this playbook repeated elsewhere. I'm thinking of Puerto Rico after Hurricanes Irma and Maria in 2017.
Same pattern. The damage from Maria was biblical,
Hmm.
and the response from the mainland was austerity and the imposition of a fiscal control board.
So the shock then leads to privatization.
Inevitably. The main target there was the public infrastructure, especially the electric system. The power grid was handed over to a private consortium, Luma Energy.
Which puts citizens at risk of higher rates and less accountability right when they're at their most vulnerable.
Exactly. It's commodifying the basic necessities of life in the middle of a catastrophe.
But I think the most extreme example, the one that really shows the ideology at work, has to be the Iraq War.
Iraq is crucial because it wasn't a natural disaster. The shock itself was man-made. It was shock and awe.
Right.
And Klein documented how the entire invasion was organized around this almost utopian idea of turning Iraq into a pure free market paradise. After the military shock, the Coalition Provisional Authority just rolled out the whole playbook. 100% foreign ownership of Iraqi assets, a flat tax, mass privatization.
I just assumed the population would be too traumatized to object.
They did. It was this incredibly naive belief that people would be so grateful for liberation that they'd accept this overnight economic demolition. But it just led to, gross incompetence. Billions in reconstruction contracts were handed out to private companies like Halliburton with almost no oversight.
And that's where the racketeering and the waste came in.
Absolutely. The ideology demanded a minimal state, which meant minimal oversight. It was a recipe for fraud. But worse, by destroying Iraq's public institutions, the army, the state-owned companies, they created this huge power vacuum that was then filled by sectarian militias. It was completely self-destructive.
It makes you think of that Milton Friedman quote, the architect of so many of these ideas. He said that when a crisis hits, the actions that are taken depend on the ideas that are lying around.
And that is such a chilling admission, isn't it? It just underlines how opportunistic the whole doctrine is. It also shows why it's so critical to have alternative ideas ready to go. A kind of disaster socialism focused on collective aid and public resilience. Because if you don't, the only ideas lying around are the ones that serve the market.
And this all leads us to the psychological cost, which really sets the stage for everything else we're going to talk about. This relentless exploitation generates a deep, pervasive, and honestly, a pretty legitimate structural cynicism.
That's the key insight. When you repeatedly see your core institutions, your schools, your hospitals, your emergency services, not just fail, but actively prioritize corporate profit during a crisis, well, your faith in official stories just collapses.
It's not an irrational distrust. It's an evidence-based skepticism. It's born from decades of watching this happen. And that vacuum of trust is the fertile ground where conspiracy theories take root.
Exactly. And no crisis provided more fertile ground than the COVID-19 pandemic. It was the ultimate global test case for this whole model.
It was a different kind of shock, right? Not one big bang, but this creeping, omnipresent crisis.
It was. And it created just unprecedented opportunities for corporate profit. The pandemic exposed huge weaknesses in government procurement all over the world. We saw reports everywhere of corporations selling PPE at massively inflated prices or using their connections to get these huge no-bid contracts.
But it wasn't just straightforward profiteering. There was a more subtle game being played with corporate social responsibility, or CSR.
Oh, absolutely. The corporate image laundering. This is where companies that produce, deeply unhealthy things, tobacco, junk food, alcohol, use the pandemic to rebrand themselves as essential, caring corporate citizens.
All while lobbying against public health policies behind the scenes.
Precisely. They'd make these very public, very philanthropic donations, funding relief efforts, donating hand sanitizer, to make sure they had a seat at the policy table.
And the hypocrisy is just staggering. You have these companies that have spent decades undermining public health, contributing to the exact conditions, obesity, diabetes, that made people more vulnerable to COVID in the first place.
The example of Coca-Cola is it's glaring. They were making huge donations to support health systems, while at the very same time spending millions to obstruct global efforts to tackle the obesity epidemic that their products fuel.
So the message is the crisis is a PR opportunity to whitewash the damage your core business model does.
It is, and it raises a fundamental question. Why did those gaps in public services, the ones corporations rushed in to fill with charity, even exist? If our public systems were properly funded and resilient, there would be no PR opportunity to exploit.
So that's the corporate side. But then you have the government response, which ushered in this massive wave of state and private surveillance, all justified by the emergency. This feels like a shift from a financial shock to a control shock.
That's a great way to put it. Governments all over the world rolled out these huge digital surveillance systems, health codes, contact tracing apps, temperature sensors, things we'd never seen in peacetime democracies.
We saw examples everywhere. Bulgaria, Argentina, using cell tower data to enforce quarantine.
Italy, too. It was a massive intensification of digital surveillance, and the emergency was the perfect excuse.
The sources call this a Schmidtian emergency discourse. That's a pretty academic term. Can you break that down?
Sure. Carl Schmitt was a political theorist, and his whole idea was that the true sovereign, the real power, is whoever gets to decide what constitutes an emergency or a state of exception.
Okay.
So a Schmidtian discourse is when the government declares an emergency in order to legally suspend normal laws and constitutional rights. During COVID, this was used to create this false choice, this trade-off.
Give up your privacy to get your health and security.
Exactly. And groups like Privacy International were sounding the alarm, saying, look, these emergency powers have a nasty habit of becoming permanent.
What's really interesting, though, is that the American public, already steeped in this structural cynicism, didn't really buy it. The Pew data from early in the pandemic is pretty revealing.
It's so telling. When they asked people if government cell phone tracking would help limit the spread of COVID, only 16% thought it would help a lot. A huge 60% thought it wouldn't make much difference.
They just didn't believe the payoff was worth the privacy invasion.
Not at all. And a clear majority, 62%, said it was flat out unacceptable for the government to use cell phones to enforce social distancing. And this was on top of the distrust that was already there. I mean, before the pandemic, 79% of people were already worried about how companies were using their data.
So, to wrap up this part, the pandemic accelerated both corporate exploitation and state surveillance, and both of those things just poured gasoline on the fire of public distrust that disaster capitalism had already lit.
Yes, and that brings us right to the psychological fallout, to the fractured reality Naomi Klein calls the mirror world. This is where her personal story with her doppelganger really kicks in.
It's such a crucial pivot from the big structural forces to the intimate personal confusion. She didn't just study this, she was living it.
Absolutely. The confusion with Naomi Wolf was more than just an annoyance. Klein found herself absorbing all this hate and criticism that was actually meant for Wolf, who was out there saying that masks were for dehumanization and vaccines had microchips.
And then it gets even weirder because Wolf starts co-opting Klein's own work. She actually twisted the shock doctrine to argue that COVID itself was an engineered crisis.
That's the ultimate doubling, isn't it? She took a theory about the exploitation of a crisis and turned it into a conspiracy about the creation of the crisis by, Bill Gates and the usual suspects.
It replaces a structural critique with personalized paranoia.
Perfectly put. And that environment is the essence of the mirror world. It's this culture of doubling, where your politics aren't about what you stand for, but who you stand against. It's all about defining yourself in opposition to some shadowy enemy.
And this creates what she calls diagonal alliances, these really strange political bedfellows.
Right. You have Naomi Wolf, a former liberal feminist, courting far-right extremists. But you also see these other bizarre pairings, like the alliance between, say, the yoga and wellness community and elements of eco-fascism.
Okay, that's one that I think confuses a lot of people. How does a focus on wellness and body purity connect to something as vile as eco-fascism?
It's all about the language of purity and contamination. In the mirror world, the focus shifts entirely inward, to the self, to the pure body. When you combine that with a critique of industrial society, which both groups might share, this obsession with purity starts to look for an external enemy.
An impurity to be purged.
Exactly. The crisis is blamed on impure globalist forces, whether that's GMOs, vaccines, or, in the case of eco-fascism, immigrants and marginalized groups. It uses the language of cleansing the body and cleansing the planet to argue for truly horrific policies like population control. It's a total rejection of the collective.
This is where Klein makes, I think, her most important point about why these theories are so sticky. She says conspiracy theorists often get the facts wrong, but get the feelings right.
This is the absolute key to understanding the appeal. The specific claims 5G causes COVID, whatever, they're nonsense. They're factually wrong. But the feeling behind them, the feeling that the world is broken, that powerful, unseen actors are profiting from our misery.
That feeling is correct.
It's entirely correct because it's validated by the entire history of disaster capitalism we just talked about. The conspiracy theory is just an emotionally satisfying story that explains a structural betrayal they've already experienced.
So it's not about the data, it's about finding a narrative that confirms a suspicion you already justifiably hold.
Precisely. And it diverts all that political anger away from real structural targets, like corporate power or tax loopholes, and channels it towards fighting shadows like the deep state.
And this whole crisis of identity ties back to something Klein wrote about years ago, the cult of the self, the rise of personal branding in the late 90s.
Yes, that Me Inc. idea.
Yeah.
The management guru Tom Peters was huge in pushing this idea that every single person had to become the CEO of Me Inc. Your life, your body, your choices, it was all a brand to be marketed and optimized.
And you can see a direct line from that to the anti-vax and wellness world.
It's the same ideology. The obsession with personal body purity, with protecting the self from contamination. It's Me Inc. on a biological level. It shifts the entire political focus away from collective problems like systemic inequality and onto a lonely individual struggle for personal purity.
And the technology we use every day just pours fuel on this fire.
The platforms are not neutral. Their algorithms are designed to promote the most extreme, polarizing, outrage-inducing content because that's what gets the most engagement. More clicks, more shares, more profit. The tech itself is built to tear us apart.
Which brings us to some pretty stark warnings from political philosophy, like from Hannah Arendt.
Arendt's work is so relevant here. She argued that real thinking is an internal dialogue, a conversation you have with yourself. It's the ability to question your own beliefs.
Which is the opposite of the mirror world.
The absolute opposite. A mirror world demands rigid, singular, branded identities. You're not supposed to have an internal dialogue. You're supposed to be an avatar for a set of slogans. And Arendt warned that when people lose that ability to think for themselves, it opens the door to conformity and, in the end, totalitarianism.
So the structural failure meets the psychological fracture, and that collision point brings us to the next phase of this crisis. The technological layer, the AI doppelganger.
Yes. If the last decade was about the breakdown of trust, the next decade will be about weaponizing that breakdown with technology. AI doppelgangers are the tools that can turn a vague feeling of being lied to into what looks like concrete, undeniable proof.
We're talking about deepfakes, AI audio, AI images, all designed to just erase the line between what's real and what's not.
And we are already seeing the damage, especially in public health. Generative AI lets you steal the identity of a trusted professional and turn it against the public.
The examples are just terrifying. We've seen deepfake videos of real doctors from respected places like the Baker Heart and Diabetes Institute, seemingly promoting fake diabetes cures.
There are those deepfake images of Dr. Carl Kruszelnicki, a really trusted science communicator in Australia, used in Facebook ads to sell scam pills.
It's a way to bypass all our normal critical thinking by manufacturing a trusted source on the spot.
It is, and we know why it works so well. Studies show people are way more likely to believe a false headline if it's paired with an AI image that has two qualities. It has to look very realistic and it has to be probative.
Okay, what do you mean by probative?
Probative just means it provides strong visual evidence for the headline. So if the headline is, "Famous Doctor Endorses Pill," a realistic deepfake of that doctor holding the pill bottle is highly probative. It looks like proof. That combination is what makes the lie so powerful.
And then there's the deeper psychological harm of just creating these replicas without permission, this AI identity theft.
The cost is huge. Imagine a perfect AI replica of you is out there saying and doing things. The stress, the anxiety, your own story, your own reputation is no longer yours to control.
The core issue is consent.
It's the total lack of consent. It shatters the idea of an autonomous self, which is, ironically, the very thing the Me Inc. culture was supposedly all about protecting.
But the technology itself isn't purely evil. This is what's so fascinating. The tech mirror has two faces. You have malicious deepfakes, but you also have this incredible technology called digital twins.
Right. Digital twins are these hyper-sophisticated digital replicas of physical things. A jet engine, a factory floor, a human heart built using AI and real-time data from IoT sensors.
And the potential in healthcare is just mind-blowing.
It really is.
Hmm.
We're talking about patient digital twins, a complete virtual replica of your body, your physiology, built from your medical records, your genetic data, data from your smartwatch.
So what can you do with that?
Well, a doctor could test a new drug on your digital twin first to see how you'd react, with zero risk to you. They could practice a complex heart surgery on your virtual heart before ever making an incision. It's the ultimate in personalized, safe medicine. The Mayo Clinic is already using them to optimize patient scheduling and cut wait times.
But when you apply this twin concept to a whole city, an urban digital twin, all those ethical alarms about surveillance start ringing again.
They do, because an urban twin, which could optimize traffic or energy use, requires a citywide sensor network collecting massive amounts of data about everything and everyone. Without incredibly strong governance, efficiency can quickly become control.
And the sources warn about something called an atrophy scenario.
That's the dystopian path. It's a future where data privacy is gone. The city becomes a system of pervasive surveillance. You get hyper-managed, secure zones for the wealthy and heavily policed, fragmented zones for everyone else. The technology that promised to bring us together becomes a tool to enforce our divisions.
It's the ultimate endpoint of that Schmidtian emergency logic, just applied permanently through technology.
It is. So the lesson is the tech isn't the problem in a vacuum.
Hmm.
But when you deploy it inside a system built on disaster capitalism, a system that profits from crisis and lacks accountability, it is almost certain to become a tool of control.
Which brings us to the big question, how do we escape this vertigo? If technology isn't the root cause, then a purely technological solution won't work.
Exactly. We can't just fact-check our way out of a crisis of faith. The solutions have to be structural. They have to address the economic rot that started it all.
So what does that look like?
First and foremost, you have to rebuild a robust public sphere. That means serious, sustained investment in public health, in education, in safety nets. You have to close the gaps that corporations rush in to exploit every time there's a crisis.
You remove the opportunity for them to play the hero.
You remove the opportunity, you rebuild trust by making public institutions so resilient they don't fail in the first place. Second, you need a complete overhaul of data governance.
To challenge the idea that our data is just a commodity to be bought and sold.
Precisely. You need strong legal frameworks built on principles like data minimization. Only collect what is absolutely necessary, and purpose limitation. Only use that data for the reason it was collected. No mission creep.
This is where things like privacy-enhancing technologies come in.
Yes, tech that's designed to protect privacy by default. But even bigger than that, we need to think about data stewardship. The idea that our collective data is a public resource, maybe managed by citizen data trusts, not private corporations, that's a direct challenge to the logic of disaster capitalism.
Okay, so that's the big structural reform. What about building resilience on a social and personal level against the AI doppelgangers?
Media literacy has to get much more sophisticated. It's not enough to say, check your source anymore. We have to teach people the mechanics of generative AI.
How to spot a deepfake.
How to spot a deepfake, but more than that, how to question the evidence strength of an image. To ask, is this picture a little too perfect? Does it feel like it was designed to prove this exact point? That's the new critical thinking.
It's a shift from asking, is this source credible, to asking, is this piece of evidence itself believable?
Exactly. And beyond that, we have to push back against polarization itself. The studies are clear. People with higher digital literacy and lower conspiracist beliefs are much better telling truth from fiction online. We have to encourage critical thinking, not just rigid branded identities.
So this entire deep dive, it's really been about tracing the line from a broken economic system to a broken reality. The crisis was manufactured by failed institutions, not by Russian bots.
And that leads right to Naomi Klein's final point, her call to action. The way out isn't more self-optimization or building a better personal brand. It has to be a turn away from the self and back toward the collective.
Away from solitary self-reflection and toward collective action.
Toward historical knowledge, toward organizing. Her message is basically log off and get onto the streets. To refocus that energy on fixing the broken systems that are feeding this whole crisis. The only way to build a shared reality is to demand real accountability and rebuild public trust from the ground up.
We've covered a lot of ground. We went from the economic shock of disaster capitalism to the psychological fracture of the mirror world, and finally to its technological expression in the AI doppelganger. And I think the key takeaway is that the real enemy here isn't the technology. It's the broken system of trust that the technology exploits so perfectly. So I want to leave you with a final thought to chew on. If the private sector is constantly profiting from crisis, which just reinforces that evidence-based public feeling that the system is rigged by malicious actors, then how can we possibly hope to build a political culture based on shared reality when the tools to create infinite, personalized, synthetic realities are getting cheaper and more persuasive every single day?
That's the question.
The problem is structural. The solution has to be collective. We've laid out the map. The next step is up to all of us.